Nice to see such a good crowd, and also a diverse crowd as well. People from outside of the department, I know, come to this, so it's really good to see you all here. Welcome to this YOHRS seminar, YOHRS being York Heritage Research Seminars. They happen every Tuesday, most Tuesdays anyway. A range of very interesting topics related to heritage, the built environment, and so forth. And we have a very diverse range of speakers, usually, as well, in this term in particular. Very good range, always aligned to some extent with our heritage teaching within the department, but with the added interest for other people as well. And we often get people from the heritage sector coming along as well. I think we've got them tonight. Maybe there's some hiding something. Anyway, I'm really thrilled to introduce our speaker this evening, Greg Keeffe. Greg is a Professor of Architecture and Urbanism at Queen's University, Belfast. I've only met Greg once before, but it's stayed with me. Gave a great talk, and we've kind of been in touch through social media and stuff since. So it's really nice to catch up again, 6 or 7 years on. But I've heard him speak before, and I know you're going to be entertained and intellectually engaged with this presentation this evening, and challenged probably as well. So Greg, great pleasure to introduce you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you'll find this interesting. This is partly a personal tale, and partly a tale of urbanism, and partly a tale of a city. It's about how culture is made in a city, really. I think, you know, I'm from Manchester, and I'm very proud to be from Manchester, and I know that I was just telling John that my genome isn't from Manchester. I'm actually only 1% British. My genome is mainly Irish. So and Manchester is a place where in 1790 there were just 20,000 people in the city, and by 1850 there was 1 million people. It's the first industrial city, and this is a story about one neighbourhood in that city, Hume, which is famous for being one of the worst places to live in the whole of the UK, probably one of the worst in the world, but actually led to Manchester, and Manchester being on the cover of Newsweek magazine, famously in 1990. And how do we get there? Well, I suppose I'm an urban designer and a professor of architecture, and so I spend my time trying to invent carbon neutral, sustainable cities and neighbourhoods. And you know, and I get paid for doing that, which is very nice. But in a previous life, I was also a guitarist in a band called Big Flame. Because that's me. And here are some of the records we did, and so forth. And we were synonymous with sort of Manchester in the we started in Christmas 1982. And we decided we'd have a 3-year life, and then we'd pack in. And no matter what happened, it's really stupid, really, because we just started to do quite well. And then we packed in, but it was partly because it was a sort of an art project, as opposed, rather than just being a band, really. And I suppose why I'm interested in cities, and why I think sustainability for me is crucial, but one of the really interesting things is that we often think that sustainability is all about things to do with environment, but actually we need all sorts of sustainability. We need social sustainability, cultural sustainability, environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and I think we often sort of concentrate on one of those things at the detriment of others, and so I'm interested in how we create really socially exciting and just cities. And I think that's one of the things this lecture is about. And the famous quote by Richard Rogers, you know, that cities are the most complex things man has designed. And they are amazing, aren't they? That if you go to a shop, there's always a banana, for example. You know, and bananas are grown in Ecuador, but you never go to the shop and there isn't a banana. You know, bananas are arriving every day. You know, we eat on average 4 a day, every person, yet the bananas still turn up, and they still turn up, and that counts for everything. No matter what you want, it's always just there. And to design that system just show it's incredibly complicated. Stuff from all over the world comes in. And so it's really interesting. But also cities are a hotbed of culture. And you know, Dave Ellis, who was professor of architecture at Manchester, you know, always used to say that cities are process-based. You have to understand that. They're not an artifact. They're a sort of system. And he said that like a garden, you need new stuff, you need to renew stuff, and he had this idea of compost, you know, that there'd be somewhere in the city that where rubbish collects, that sort of fertilizes the next generation of the city. And I suppose one of my problems with the idea of the creative city is that, you know, it comes from this Smithson idea that, you know, museums are like tombs, you know, and everything is turning into a museum, you know. And so we're making these dead spaces, and I've had to have dealings with Prince Charles, who's here having a pint of beer in Nelson, Lancashire, where I was responsible for an urban design project. And this quote, actually, after I first used it in a lecture, they took it off the website. But it tells you a lot about new urbanism, that one of the ideas is that we're trying. But it's a definition of urbanism from a king, isn't it, or a king in waiting? That everyone knows their place. You know, there's a place for everyone, and everyone knows their place. So, I'm poor, I know my place. You're rich, you know your place. You know, I think cities are much more contested, and I'm actually really enjoy the contested nature of the city, and I think we've got to be very careful that we don't overplan. And this is shown. This is Poundbury, which is Prince Charles's dream development in just outside Dorchester in Dorset, and I love the development plan. It's just full of prohibitions, you know, and some of them are crazy, aren't they? Woven panels of wooden fencing are not allowed, you know, and there's also something about caravans. The parking of caravans should not be allowed because that might encourage ordinary people. You know, and so you read it all, and actually, you know, it's a sort of an aesthetic control of the city, because it implies that they'd really like a control of people in the city, but actually controlling their aesthetics is quite an important way of controlling people, I would say. So I have a challenge with that, and I'm more interested in Gordon Matter Clark's view of the city. You know. Here is what we have to offer you in its most elaborate form: confusion, guided by a clear sense of purpose somehow. So there's a really interesting idea of the city that actually nobody really knows how they work or what goes on, because they're too complicated. And so we have to enjoy the complexity of the city somehow, and not try and control it too much. And you know, we've got these terrible things happening now. You know, Manchester is the 12th best European business destination, for example, at the moment. We're glad to know. And you need all these things to click up. But I seem to notice that you also need other things that people don't seem to mention. So one thing Manchester did to move up the league table was to improve the link between the city centre and the airport, so you couldn't see any poor people. Well, maybe it was just to make it a much quicker journey. I don't know, but just so happened there's been a lot of poor people on that journey, you know. And that famously, after the riots of '81, when what's he called? Michael Heseltine famously drove into the city at Prince's Parkway. He looked at the flats in Hume, where I was living at the time, and said, "They have to go." And then carried on into the city centre to meet the people in the town hall. And the only thing he said in the journey up the road was, "They have to go." So there's some interesting ideas there about social cleansing. And creative cities are just going crazy. This is the EU tool to promote mutual exchange and learning between cities to boost culture-led development. Don't get me started on that. But some of this is Manchester's performance at the moment. It scores 2 passenger flights for some reason. I don't know. Surely it's got an international airport. Surely, I just wonder, where does Stoke-on-Trent score? If Manchester scores 2 out of 100, what does Stoke-on-Trent score? I was like, direct trains to other cities, 5. Well, it is on an island, so maybe that limits you a bit more than if you were somewhere else, But you look around, and so, cultural venues, sites and landmarks, museums, cinema seats, concerts and shows, theatres, all frightfully middle class, isn't it? There's no how many nights of grime there are in basements of which I think is pretty important to my son, and he would see that as being the most important culture in the city. How many graffiti artists are in operation? Not on there. Tourists over, I said, cinema attendance. It's crazy, and that apparently gives you a score, and then you are better or worse than one of your competitors, apparently. And I just think that's this sort of way of viewing cities, this neoliberal way of seeing from culture to creative industries, I see it as a real problem for cities. And I suppose all this is trying to somehow give your city a USP that it may or may not have, that may come from somewhere. Obviously, whenever you go anywhere, people will always mention Bobby Charlton. If you say, I'm from Manchester, oh, Bobby Charlton. I was in Taipei, people were coming up and saying, David Beckham? That's all they could say in the whole language. That actually some things transport much better than other things. And obviously music and sport are quite interesting things really on that. But back to Hume, one of the things about Manchester, when I was saying about those million people who arrived in 50 years, it was the Shenzhen of its day. If you imagine this incredible shock city, there's this is Mary Barton, Elizabeth Gaskell writing here in the book, and so, there's some fields near Manchester, well known to the inhabitants as Green Hayesfield, Hume, and it says, it's one of the most beautiful bits of England. That was about here. Just only for a short while. Because what happened is things start to change really, really rapidly in Manchester. You can see that post 1820 that they sold off the land to the south of the city and started gridding it up to extend the city southwards. They also extended it northwards, eastwards and westwards actually. But it was incredible. And you can see, these are the second wave of properties that were in the city actually. So, and because these photos are taken about 1900, but it was pretty grim. If you look at these aerial photos of Hume, this is Stretford Road here, and St Mary's Church there, and not a tree, not a piece of grass, not anything, and actually incredibly brutal. This is the 1909 OS map, and the city centre is just beyond the top of the page, and look what you see there. Absolutely incredible, the sort of unfettered sort of capitalism of the early industrial city. Absolutely amazing, really. And actually, even though I've lived in South Manchester for at least nearly 40 years, it's difficult for me to recognise anything on that map. Actually, it's incredible, absolutely amazing. And of course, when you look at it, this is Moss Side here, Alexandra Park, and this is Hume here in the distance. Some of these properties are still here, and they're pretty grim. But look, this is a much more organised piece of urbanism than the urbanism of Hume, which is incredibly dense. I love this sort of photo. You can find they took these photos from a hot air balloon, and you can see there isn't a single thing growing in the whole neighbourhood. Absolutely incredible. So Hume was this incredibly miserable place. It was considered the worst place in Britain to live. In 1960, the city council had a review of slum clearance, and they admitted that wholesale demolition was the only option. The houses were so badly made and so close together, and most of them, quite a lot of them, were back to back. Many without toilets or without running water, and so they had to do something. People often wonder, why did they do all the clearances? But actually, the properties were incredibly poor. I have a great story that my mum taught at a primary school in North Manchester, which was run by nuns, and the nuns were a German order. And one of the nuns' sisters wanted to learn English, so my mum said, "Oh, she could come and stay at our house and learn English." And my dad picked her up from the airport and drove back across Manchester through Hume towards North Manchester. And halfway there, she burst into tears, this girl. And my dad said, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And she said, "Look what our bombers did to your city." And he said, "No, we've done it ourselves, actually." Because basically all this was cleared, as you can see on this map, that basically there was a sort of complete erasure of one piece, and that's what I call this jumping city. There's certain bits of city that instead of having an emergent future where things develop in a piecemeal way, they just keep flipping into a different sort of system. And Hume has gone from an agricultural thing to a sort of slum-based thing to a modernist thing, and then onwards. And I'll show you as it goes on. It's quite interesting how it sort of moves. And this is what they built. This is part of it. This is Hume. This is Hume 3. These are known as the Inca houses, named famously by Elsie Tanner of Coronation Street. These are the Crescents, built by Wilson and Wormsley architects. And you may think that these people were really bad architects, but Wilson and Wormsley did some absolutely beautiful modernist houses, and they are really, really talented. So, and these, of course, were based on the Bath Crescents, of course, and they're named after, in a sort of act of hubris, I suppose, are famous. So this is William Kent, Robert Adam, John Nash, Charles Barry Crescents. Sort of quite humorous, really, but south-facing. Grass in the middle. They looked like a new idyll, really. And of course, as you can see, by 1980, every single bit of the map has been erased, really, that belonged to Manchester. And of course, things have been added, like freeways. This is Princess Parkway going to the airport. There's the Mancunian Way, the city bypass, and so there's all the modernist things. And the neighbourhood was set up on a sort of grade separation thing, so that pedestrians and traffic would never meet, which meant that when you were walking home alone, where there's no cars, over one of these footbridges, with someone coming the other way, maybe with a machete, there was no one going to hear you scream. You know what I mean? Could be pretty edgy. And so here are the Crescents. I used to live here. I lived in 120, William Kent here, and 129 a bit further up, a bit later on. And you could move in, and the story is quite interesting, really. That the Crescents were finished in 1975, and by 1979 they banned families from them. So they only had 4 years with children in them. Partly because children were falling off balconies and killing themselves, or being electrocuted by the rather dodgy modular systems they had for stepping down voltage, where you could take the case off with a screwdriver and find 11,000 volts inside, so people blew their arms off and things. So by the time the end of the 70s came, there was a really transient population living in them. And what started to happen was bands started, particularly punk bands, started to sort of see themselves in somehow, you know, trying to find the most extreme environments in the city, have their photos taken there. So here's Joy Division sat on one of the footbridges over the Princess Parkway with the flats all around, snow, which is unusual for Manchester at this time of the year. You know, and these things started to bring Hume into the consciousness, really. And Anton Corbijn's photos of Joy Division in particular were really interesting for that bleak time around about 1980, when the future was disappearing out of the UK. You know, my childhood, Bobby John's. You know, it was interesting. You know, we were at 6 minutes to midnight, weren't we, with the CND? We had 1 million people on the dole. Winter of discontent. It was an incredibly miserable time, and then followed by Thatcher. It was quite an interesting time to be a kid, really, just post-punk. And I think one of the most important bands who really put Hugh on the map were A Certain Ratio, and one of the unsung bands of Factory, really, and probably the most important band of the whole Factory roster, I would think, personally. And they had an interview with Paul Morley in the New Musical Express where they were in a Hume flat, and that sort of brought Hume into the attention. But there were other things that made Hume what it was. The Factory, you know, Factory Echoes was set up by 3 friends, you know, Tony Wilson, Alan Erasmus, Rob Gretton, and they originally ran the club in North Manchester, in Collyhurst. And the problem was the local hoods used to beat up all the weirdos. So they decided to move the club to South Manchester, where they thought it was a bit safer, and they chose the Russell Club, which was actually quite an interesting club because it was actually owned by Greater Manchester Transport. It was actually a bus drivers club, and a lot of the bus drivers were Jamaican, so it had this incredible sort of roster of Jamaican bands playing there. So and actually it was one of those scenes where, you know, the weirdos of punks could slot in because nobody really noticed them in the scene. So that's why it was chosen, really. And I think the interesting, and then so why did it grow up, really? I think obviously proximity is quite important, and you look at the things that sat around. Here's the PSV here on the corner of the Crescents. Then you've got Manchester University here, Manchester Met Art School there. The Hacienda is just on the top of the drawing there. That those things sort of put this stuff in relation to each other. Probably, you know, they were touchstones for a massive community of people. And then you had this also thing where you could be seen. So there was something quite enjoyable about the upstarts who live there. You know, we could create a fuss and it would be seen by commuters on the motorways and things, and they would be outraged or whatever. And that was quite important because outrage was quite an important thing, I think. And so it's quite an interesting location. This is the Hacienda, and of course, famously lost a lot of money, but it was a beautiful design in a building that was originally a yacht showroom. I don't know who 50 miles from the sea would be buying a yacht. I'm not sure. Obviously, the yacht, I don't think they sold many yachts there, but it was quite an interesting space. And I was a glass collector in the cocktail bar downstairs for several years, and it was quite interesting because when it first opened, it was really the first place where there was made for alternative people in Manchester. Other than that, we had to borrow nights in venues, and suddenly there was a venue that was ours every night of the year, you know, and if you remember, you used to pay, I think you paid £2.50 to become a member, and then you could get in free every night there wasn't a band on, so it became this sort of place where everybody sort of collected. And that made Hume even more, obviously, it was walking distance from Hume. And actually, it was not only just walking distance, but walking distance in a good direction. Because it was a much safer direction to walk to the city centre than to walk the opposite direction to Moss Side, where it could get really edgy. So it was also quite good. And so what happened was, by 1980, there were hardly any of the Crescent flats occupied. And you could basically turn up, as I did, and with a bread knife, cut a hole in the wall. The front of the flats were made out of cardboard. So they were so I bought a bread knife from the shop in the little precinct, and then sawed a hole in the kitchen wall. That's how secure they were. Climbed in through a small hole with a 100-amp fuse, plug it into the electrics, and bang! Oh, there you go. Well, actually, the first one flat, I went in 119 first, and I plugged it in. It went bang, and I woke up 2 hours later with a cut head. So it wasn't very good. So I bought another fuse and put some wellies on, and then plugged the next one in, and the next one 120, and that one was okay. So I moved in there. Obviously, I patched up the hole with a piece of plywood, and so it was really easy to move in. You could go to the council and say that you were occupying this flat, and they'd give you a rent book, but nobody ever paid rent or anything because the council had given up on Hume. So and then by the time we got to about 1984, every single flat was occupied with someone doing something. Artists, musicians, wasters, drug dealers, drug addicts, whatever. It just became this sort of place where people collected because you could get a flat so easily. And so, and it was an amazing setting because obviously you had these big amphitheatres and you could put a speaker on your balcony and you could broadcast your favourite music echoing around these amazing crescents. It was just absolutely phenomenal, you know, as a place to be a young person. But it was also exceptionally dangerous. But you could have a flat next door to yours that was your practice flat for your band. You know, or you could, I know people who had party flats where they made a flat, took all the interior walls out and just had parties there and lived next door. You know, so, you know, it was an absolutely amazing environment. You know, hard to imagine in these days of things. And I suppose Nick Blinko, who I was later in another band with, wrote a novel called Acid Casuals. And this is one of the protagonists lives in Hume, you know, and I think it's a really nice bit of writing that sort of describes exactly what it was like, you know, where jump crosses over a patch of green where the pit bulls played. It was about it. You know, the dogs were pretty dangerous generally, as dangerous as people. I don't know which was more dangerous, the people or the dogs, but generally a bit of both. But it was a really interesting environment, and you can see the architecture was fantastically modernist and absolutely beautiful, and you could ride a bike 5 floors up for about 2 miles if you wanted, you know. So I had a BMX and I used to cycle round up on that top floor, you know, and it's really smooth screed on there, so it's really good for riding, you know, and so all those things that, you know, you thought you were living in this sort of other world, you know. And I suppose, going back to architecture, I suppose one of the problems of architecture, which Rem Koolhaas sort of alludes to here, is that architecture is really slow, and we live in a world of accelerated cultures. So although we expect buildings to last for a long time, the function in which they originally were developed for might have long gone, you know. And so this was a particularly quick one where in 4 years, the flats had gone from being useful to being redundant to being useful again, with totally different things in them. And I suppose somehow we've always got this time lag in the city of what we build, because we're always building the future, but we don't know what the future is. Because anything we build is meant to last, as architects, meant to last 60 years or longer. But actually, what's it going to be like in 60 years' time? We've no idea, have we? So we make things, and we just hope we get it. We have dreams about futures. And I would say the best way to predict the future is to design it. Whatever you design becomes the future. But it's a problem in a world of accelerated cultures, and I suppose that's one of the challenges for architecture of the 21st century, really. So just to recap on this dynamic, from Victorian slum to the Wilson Wormsley master plan, it's 150 years in 10 years. A change of 150 years in 10 years, which I think is really, really interesting. And then, the development, here's some more of the flats, it's hard to believe that it wasn't a great scheme in a way. Architecturally, there's some really nice moves in there and some really interesting things, but the flats were appallingly badly made. And I did an exhibition about Hume in Urbis when it was open, and someone gave me this quote, and it really rings true that, I don't think that even seeing the pyramids for the first time could compare. It was amazingly monumental stuff. And I think that was part of the thing that made the backdrop to bands, that they could position themselves behind this stuff. And like I was saying, and these large areas of grass contained by things allowed us to have impromptu events all the time in this space, which was also really interesting. So you could have a party, or you could have a band on, or you could have a festival, or anything, just because there were no rules and no demarcation of space beyond the sort of cup of the presence. And then 1992, as part of the Michael Hestein's city action, the Hume gets demolished, even though the council still has 40 years to pay on the mortgage. So still paying it now, I think. Apparently they're quite hard to demolish. The concrete was incredibly dense. So although there were cardboard walls, the actual structure was incredibly dense concrete, which is why they were so hard to heat. And then the new Hume got built, which was a sort of neoliberal model of a mixture of residential social landlords and private developers. So these are homes during the houses. Look at the price to live in Hume. Looks a lot of money to me to live in Hume, but there you go. And again, and the idea was to make the new Hume was to make a sort of what they called a European city master plan, whatever that means. But it's sort of based around the idea of a courtyard, housing, about buildings reaching the street, making streets rather than roads, and actually, considering that it's sort of neoliberal and sort of thing, actually it was quite faithful to the original strategy plan for the area, and actually probably as a piece of urbanism is not so bad. But actually one of the things is in 1984 someone did a survey and there were over 200 bands living in Hume in 1984, and I'm not sure there's even one there now. So all this spring cleaning hasn't done a lot for Manchester music culture. And I suppose architecture is sort of how we brand places, isn't it? When we see a lot of fireworks going off, adds to the drama a little bit. As we look at Paris and we see the Eiffel Tower, or we see the Twin Towers in New York, or the Empire State, or the top of the Rock, or something in New York. You know, that punk Manchester had the Crescents as a backdrop. You know, and without them, punk Manchester sort of disappeared. And so it's quite an interesting journey, and I think to look at it, you know, to go through a sort of 40-year history that really is driven a lot by youth culture. Really interesting that actually youth culture rebranded Manchester and actually probably saved Manchester itself in lots of ways. And as we got to the end, once demolition was agreed, it became even more lawless than it had been, which was really bizarre, where crazy things like punks from all over Europe turn up and have a punk picnic for lasted 2 weeks. You know, absolutely bizarre things. That's the, you know, and then sort of all these travellers turn up and blockade themselves in some of the courtyards and refuse to let anyone in, and then block the road to stop the police coming, and have all sorts of parties. So the end was even more mad than the middle. Absolutely crazy times, you know. And you know, and so I've been trying to theorize about, because I like cities to be process based, and I'm trying to understand the dynamics of how places come and go in cities, you know. And if you and looking around, if you look at other places that were similarly branded as places for youth culture, you look at I don't know, say Kreuzberg in Berlin, or Lower East Side Manhattan, or places like that, or maybe Christiania in Copenhagen, or even Brixton in London. You know, you look at those neighborhoods where, you know, sort of youth cultures thrive the most. It starts with this collapse of what we consider society in a city. You know, that's the first thing that happens. And then there's a sort of a retreat from that space because it's got loads of things wrong with it. So you end up with loads of empty space. And then what you find is young people have no money, so they're attracted to bits of town where they can have space, you know. And then you get this cultural appropriation of that space. And then what happens is then people become interested in it again, because actually it's considered that this might cause the rebellion that no one wants to happen. So there's usually some sort of interest, some sort of grant-funded stuff, or some sort of erasure of that space because it's full of young alternative people. And then you get this investment and gentrification of the place, and then it sort of loses all the things it had, you know, in this sort of vegetative state of sort of acceptance of its new gentrified form. And I think there's something interesting about that, and obviously whether that cycle then starts again at some point and starts going. But I think there's something about understanding cities as a process rather than as things. We're so used to looking at objects, we objectify the city. And I think what we've got to start doing is look at the processes that make the city and use them in a clever way. So I suppose, you know, these are my conclusions. Really, is first that somehow music and cities are really tied very closely together. That we understand the two together. So we understand Manchester bands, and we can't separate the band from Manchester, and we can't actually separate Manchester from the band. You know, that they sort of they're sort of like, it's like a sort of animal and an environment. You know, you can't separate an animal from its environment. You know, that actually. So Oasis are Mancunian. They go. You know, I remember being in a bar watching Man United in Tokyo, and you know, I was obviously the only person from Manchester in the bar, but I was probably the only person from Europe in the bar, and all the Japanese fans were singing Oasis songs all through the game, just jumping up and down. It's absolutely amazing. And so the music can't be separated from the place, and I think so. So that tie of those two things together, I think, is really, really important. And then there's something to do with this slowness of architecture that creates redundant infrastructure. That really is really important. I'm worried that we're managing cities too tightly now, that we're not allowing sort of redundant infrastructure to occur or sit there. We're always trying to spring clean it, sort it out. And then, if you ask any person who's creative, who's young, the most important thing is that it's cheap. If they want space, they want cheap space because they have no money, And when I lived in Hume Crescents, I was on the dole, and I had about £30. I think I had £28 a week, and I think beer was £1 a pint. So I was trying to work out. So 28 pints of beer a week is 4 a night, isn't it? So therefore, I had no money for food. And never mind money for rent or electricity or gas. That we were living at that sort of level, and somehow we need to understand that cultural things are people living really on the edge of financial situations, and somehow we have to understand that therefore they need cheap spaces, and then somehow. But what we have to realise is that then, once it gets used in that sort of way, rebrands a place and it gives it a different vibe. And you look at Hume, because of its jumpingness and its erasure, it's unusual. But if you go to Kreuzberg or Lower East Side or Tribeca, and you look at how they've changed over the years, they've been totally branded by the culture that is no longer there. So if you go to Tribeca, you can find Harvey Weinstein in a bar now, can't you? Whereas before you would find interesting artists and musicians living in hovels in that bar, but now it's obviously Harvey's in there. Well, he's not in there anymore. He's on the run, is he? I don't know. Don't quote me on that. Might send Mossad after me. I was reading that today. They had Mossad agents hunting down people. So, as an urban designer, I'm reflecting on that somehow we need to make sure that we create those compost heaps in cities. When I ran the exhibition at Urbis, I'll show you some of the images from it. But we created this model of the Crescents where people come in and build their own flat as a band, and they could occupy one of the boxes and put a CD in and put things about the band in. It was really interesting that most of the bands lived in suburbia. They didn't live in the inner city anymore. They lived with their mum and dad in Cheadle or somewhere. You know what I mean? That actually they were all 7 or 8 miles out of the city, living with their mums and dads. A very different environment from that, because it's become too expensive to occupy the city of Manchester now, which is, I think, a real crime. And actually, one of the biggest problems of Manchester is it's pricing itself out of the cultural market that it wanted to be in the first place. And somehow, I'm very worried about cultural industries and creative industries as a term and what they mean, and how and generally it's someone my age who decides. Once you set up a cultural industries thing, they give someone my age the job of choosing who gets promoted and who gets things. Whereas in Hume, the best got promoted. whereas what happens now is I end up choosing them, so I don't choose the gangster rapper because that's the stuff my son's into. I choose stuff that's a bit like the sort of stuff that I'm into. You know what I mean? And I really worry about the curation of the cultural city as a real problem for the future. And somehow there's something important about outrage for young people, and I think one of the things is we have to make sure that if we are going to make these places, that they're not moved further and further out of the city where no one sees them. I think we need to have the production and the consumption close together in some way, so that there can be real outrage, because I think good culture should always be outrageous, new culture, and so this was the exhibition. I did a service where you see the 4 crescents here, and these were the ones where bands could put in their work, and by the end of the exhibition every single one was full. So there's still a lot of interesting musical culture in Manchester. It's just no longer so close to the city centre. And the list of bands who lived in Hume during the 80s is quite phenomenal, really. As a thing, some absolutely amazing people like Nico from the Velvet Underground lived in a flat in the Crescents, for example. What was she doing there? I know what she was doing there, but I can't say it on TV. I'll let you know later. But also, Gino Washington was also had a flat in the Crescents. Sort of really, really bizarre links with other cultures and other times. So that's it. The story of Hume in the 80s. Thank you.
Fabulous, great, thank you so much. Lots of questions, some of which we'll ask you afterwards.
Nice.
So, questions and comments from the floor, as it were. Yes.
I found that extremely challenging, interesting, extremely challenging. Had this sort of distance between this image of the crescent and its the dream with which it was constructed, and the reality of how that didn't last, and it was taken over by a culture, not a subculture, by a culture. And that was removed and replaced with something else, which you call a vegetative state.
Yeah.
And I just have this distance between your view of both those. I'm sure those people living in there now, paying £284,000 per house, whatever, don't consider it a vegetative state. But and there's another element to it, that does the culture derive from the opportunity of that decay of that building, as it were, or those sets of buildings? Would you not have had the culture because of the buildings? Did the buildings create it, or was that a response to the political scene of the 80s, etc.? It's not just a binary situation, if you know.
No, I think that's an interesting point. I think somehow, obviously, punk and the idea of urban decay was quite a good fit, but most youth culture has sort of enjoyed its place in failed schemes. I think also, I didn't really mention Moss Side, which is to the south of Hume. And of course, that was a big Jamaican area in the 70s and 80s. So there was a link with dub reggae that I think was really important as well. And actually, the real soundtrack to the Crescents was dub reggae. There were people with big sound systems in those flats and using the Crescents in an incredible way to make amazing, soundscapes and things. So I think there's a range of those things. I think I do worry that I think we're expecting kids to behave properly these days. I think in the 70s and 80s we were allowed to be badly behaved, and I think the introduction of the ASBO and the idea of hug a hoodie and all those sorts of things have sort of meant that we've produced a lot of people who behave, haven't we? And I suppose the vegetative state is partly based on the fact that it's lots of people behaving, and I suppose the 70s and 80s were full of misbehaving people, and I think that's quite an interesting idea for culture is how do you cultivate misbehavior.
Is that legitimate poor architecture then, because you've created that environment for misbehaviour?
I don't know. I think the thing about architecture is that because cities are complicated or very complex, you have a tendency to think one or two things are important in a scheme, and you design with those as the key ideas. And then what happens is you find that life contains everything. So, when there were no bathrooms and there was no greenery in the original Hue, you react against that and you create bathrooms and loads of greenery. But of course, and then you say, and there's loads of pollution with traffic, so you separate people from traffic and you create other problems by doing that. And so in a way, I suppose we have to enjoy the fact that everyone's flawed. I don't think we know the solutions to cities now, actually. I think, most cities work in spite of the architecture, maybe.
We'll go to Sarah next, and then we'll work our way around the room.
Would you argue that, based on what you said, that outrage sort of could come around in a cycle? Because we've lived, like, in comparison to the 80s, we've had Tory rule for quite a long time. There is austerity, there is unemployment, and there is a certain amount of youth disaffection, especially amongst, like, students who do live in the city centre and who do adopt these cultural values, like there's a lot of music and art and things like that. So do you think that it could happen again on a large scale if this political environment goes on for much longer? Because I, for one, would say that it would, because I feel a level of outrage myself.
Yeah, well, I think, I would think it was pretty desperate in the early 80s. I'm not quite sure it's quite as desperate. Maybe after Brexit, you may be there, but actually it was incredibly desperate.
But based on what you said about kids are expected to behave, like crime rates in certain areas are going up, like Ashton-under-Lyne. That's terrible at the minute, based on what I've been reading on the ABN. But it's just things like that. Like, I think based on the current political climate, I don't think it will go away forever. I think it has to have a resurgence at some point, because a lot of people are already saying they can't tolerate it for much longer. Well,
I think, in a way, we've got to enjoy the contested nature of the city. I think all through history, cities have been incredibly contested places. And I think, trying to quell the contestation, I don't think is necessarily the right thing to do. I think we've got to sort of enjoy the contestation. And that would be part of that, really, wouldn't it? That actually, I think by expecting people to behave, you nullify the culture of the city, because I think it is about misbehaviour somehow.
Do you think that there'll be a resurgence of that amongst the youth in the next, say, 10 years?
I hope so. It's up to you, isn't it? It's up to you. I hope,
Okay, we'll come to Colleen. We'll work our way across.
Thank you for that fantastic talk. Your work to me evokes both Stuart Brand's kind of low road buildings, and that he felt that these so-called low road buildings could be changed and mutilated and repurposed to host a whole sort of creative industries, whereas so-called high road buildings, which are architect designed and are very structured, are actually very limited to cultural production. But also, in a way, Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, in that he says that there has been a realism that has been created that is kind of a capital R realism, that absorbs everything, absorbs even any kind of protestation, absorbs punk, and just regurgitates it as some kind of commodified culture. And so I wonder, though, if the cities that you present are this constant cycle of sort of these compost bins then growing up and then becoming cultivated as one would necessarily expect out of compost bins, or if you would hope that the compost would pile up and keep producing creative industry. Yeah,
well, I suppose the great thing about the flows of things at the moment, we're in a world, I was thinking when I was 18, I'd never really been anywhere. That actually, I think I've been to Ireland and probably I've been to Liverpool a couple of times. I didn't go to France I never went abroad until I was 20. you know, that actually, you know, that actually, you know, there's a lot more flows of things now in a globalized world, aren't there? So we must be leaving interesting compost places behind all over the place. I know Leipzig's quite interesting at the moment. I don't know if anyone's had a look at Leipzig. You know, there's some really interesting things happening in the east of Germany because of the movement west of people. You know, and so I think those are really interesting things. I think it's like it's having one of the reasons why the band only went for 3 years was to have a continual revolution. We just didn't think we should occupy the space for too long. We thought there were other kids coming along behind us who should have a chance to occupy the space, and that's why, you know, I'm not a fan of New Order or these bands who've gone on forever, because I think they've just taken up space from younger bands who should have been allowed, you know, and who should have been allowed to have their time in the limelight. So I think we need a continuous revolution. And if that's place-based or whether it's culturally based on only a few years, I think somehow we've got to be careful we don't have a nostalgia for things. I'm not nostalgic about Hume. I'm interested in how it can reoccur, you know, but I don't want to have a big statue of me sat on top of the public toilets, you know, playing the guitar or anything. That would be a laugh. Maybe I do want that. 3D printed, I think, out of urea or something. I don't know, but you know, but I think, you know, I'd like to think that every city has, you know, a sort of space that's alive, you know, that's where it can happen, where you're unfettered by money. You know, I think now what I notice in Manchester is a lot of there seems to be two cultures. There seems to be a sort of trustafarian culture of culture through people who don't have to make money because they've mums and dads are rich or whatever, and then there's things happening in Ashton-under-Lyne with grime artists where there's no money, you know, and yet somehow in Hume all those things came together, you know, and I think it'd be great if we could have spaces in the city where things can happen. But I think the problem is that cycle I was talking about, gentrification, happens anyway. So the venue has to keep moving. And I think that's the important thing, isn't it? Somehow.
David.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you're saying about the gentrification, because Hume was gentrification in effect, the Arches were, and a lot of the other cities that you mentioned, I think that repurposing of an area happened when it fell out of use, in effect, for various reasons. But I'm just thinking that they were sort of municipal places. So Hume was built by the council, in effect. So what you don't have now, which you did have then, was an area that could be left to go to waste. Because all the places that could be a crucible for new, and the question from the front about will it happen again, it's been forced into, you know, the hinterlands around Ashton and Oldham Island and places, because it can never happen in a city where there isn't a big municipally owned area to decay again. Because how would that decay occur? Because obviously, if you think about anecdotes, think of all that big kind of belt.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
There isn't one owner, i.e. the council, to abandon it.
No.
So I don't think it could happen in the same way. But it might happen in different ways, in little what amounts of provinces outside provinces.
Yeah, but I think there's something as well as it being somewhere on the map, you know. It's difficult. I can't.
Bus to go to that area. 6 miles south. I couldn't walk.
No,
but it was a destination.
Yeah, it was. But it was in this. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. Really, I think somehow we have to understand that there's branding involved too, isn't there? The sort of the co-occurrence of band and place is quite important. Like, you know, it's difficult to have a band from Ashton-under-Lyne, isn't it? I know Cabbage are from Ashton-under-Lyne, don't they? Staley Bridge or somewhere. You know, but they would never say they're from Ashton-under-Lyne. They say they're from Manchester, wouldn't they? You know that actually you need somewhere that can be understood globally now as well. I think, which is quite an interesting challenge for small market towns, isn't it, to have a culture. I remember Leamington Spa had a big death metal scene at one time, didn't it? You know, and I was thinking, I wonder if Leamington Spa could ever be the head, be the at the forefront of some other weird culture again. Whether the world's too big for that to happen now.
Very interesting. I'm just wondering. Obviously, the older Hume was destroyed, and this was built in its place. Could this have happened in the older Hume? And B, was there something to do with the landmark quality of that building that put it into people's psyche that influenced this change? Kind of backing what the point was at the back. And C, finally, would this ever happen in Jane Jacobs City?
That's a good question. The first one, could it have happened in the old Hume? I think it did happen in the old Hume. Actually, I think it probably did. And my dad was a Irish rebel singer. So he went around, the northwest of England singing rebel songs in pubs every night. And so it did happen, but it was different. I think there's something with punk and the idea of in the city. It was really, really important, and I think everything needs a backdrop. I think the contextual relationship of performer and the backdrop is really, really important. I think because there are only eight notes in music, rather than a few extra bits and pieces. You know what I mean? Actually, my dad couldn't tell the difference between the music I played and Wham. Because he wasn't interested. So actually the difference really was that one was based somewhere and one was based somewhere else, I suppose, for him. And Jane Jacobs, could the city have happened to Jane Jacobs? I don't know. I don't think Jane Jacobs' city really existed. I think it was a figment of her imagination, personally. I just think, she didn't mention that someone got knifed on the street or that someone got shot, or anything like that. It was always nice things, wasn't it? Like you knew the butcher's, you knew the butcher's name or something, or whatever. But we know American cities were incredibly violent in the 1930s, weren't they? Incredibly violent. But she's not going, wasn't it great when we had gangsters with machine guns wandering around the city, blowing people away? She never mentions that. So I think she's trapped in another nostalgia as well. I try not to sort of judge the city. I just like you can't judge a beehive. There's not a beehive isn't better than another beehive. They're just beehives. And I think the city, somehow we got to stop judging it and start enjoying each city for what it is. Somehow, I think that's the challenge. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm a big fan of Jane Jacobs. This could be an interesting question later.
Hi. Just build on a point that David started off with here. I was just wondering to the extent that this sort of recolonisation of city interiors with creative talent which is attainable, but also desirable as well. So I think in the 1980s, this was through necessity that people occupied these spaces because they were the ones which were available to them. Now, today, I would say the online environments are the places where people are going because that is through necessity. When you said yourself that a lot of creative talent is now, it's in suburbia, it's living with their parents. So I'm wondering to what extent we should actually be engineering this.
Yeah, well, it's quite an interesting question. Oh, sorry, just putting my water there. I was just thinking of say Williamsburg. I don't know if any of you have been to Williamsburg in Brooklyn. When you go there, everyone is identical. It's like hipster Stepford Wives. You know what I mean? When you go there, everyone is exactly the same. And so people, even in spite of all that, people are still collecting in places, aren't they? I suppose one thing you have with creative people, you have the most mobile people, because generally they travel relatively lightly. They're generally well connected. So in their 6 degrees of separation from things, they're a lot nearer more things than most people. So I suppose the internet's really interesting, but I still think that a lot of the provenance of something comes from where it sits. It's really interesting. I was just thinking then of when Adidas bought Reebok. It's really interesting because Reebok, of course, was in Bolton. And so Adidas bought Reebok, and then what's the first thing they did? Move it to Manchester. Because nobody in San Francisco knew where Bolton was. you know what I mean? And so they had to relocate it to get the provenance for what it was. And I think provenance is quite an interesting thing, isn't it? Appellation contrôlée, like, is it a sparkling wine or is it champagne? It's that sort of thing. And there's something in that codependency of culture and cities that means that Liverpool bands aren't like Manchester bands, aren't like Leeds bands, are they? Or like Sheffield's bands. They're all, as soon as you hear a Liverpool band, you go, oh yeah, we know what you're like. And so I think the internet's really interesting, but I'm not sure it's really beaten place yet somehow.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that I think there's a new form of provenance which is being developed at the moment, and it's how you come together online.
Yeah.
And I think we're yet to see the fruits of that, but I think within sort of 5 to 10 years, that's going to be as important as geographical provenance.
Yeah. And I think what you'll find is, I suppose, culture grows under your toenails. You know what I mean? We'll be polishing our nails, and we'll be doing all that, but underneath somewhere where we haven't noticed, there'll be culture, and that's really the most exciting thing, isn't it? The more you try and control it, stuff will happen elsewhere, and I suppose the excitement is there'll always be somewhere, won't there? It'll just pop up in between, as you say, between the flags of some paving stone. There's something growing. No matter how much you try and organise the space, culture will emerge somewhere. But I think it is a challenge for the globalised city, how it cultivates culture that isn't totally manicured.
Any more questions or comments? Yes.
You start saying that every city has to have like a compost area, but then you mentioned Copenhagen and Christiania, and to me that's not really a compost area. I think it's vibrant, but they also embrace the whole sort of tourists going over there, and there's no police and there's a lot of drugs, but it doesn't seem as unfriendly as somewhere like you, for example.
But I suppose if you plotted it in terms of like a lifetime, you'd say Christiania is middle-aged. You know what I mean? So it's playing all the games of culture, it's opening the bars, it's doing that, but it's probably not like it was in 1975. You know what I mean? That when it was young and really extreme.
They all go around with the whole sort of hoodies up, and you don't see any of their faces.
But they're quite nice, really. but I think the edginess is quite an interesting thing, because I suppose the Prince Charles thing is everyone knows their place and everyone says hello in the street and it's the James Jacobs world. But actually, as I said, is heaven a place where nothing ever happens? That's a Talking Heads song, isn't it? For those who aren't old enough to know that. But I was thinking, that actually, that as you get older, you want to live in a place where nothing happens, and somehow we're now trying to design cities where nothing ever happens because nothing's left to chance. And I worry about the smart city. I think it's another horrendous idea. I'd rather have smart citizens who make stuff happen than just a load of data about Muppets going to work. You can quote me on that. but you do you know what I mean? So somehow we have to make, we are ecological. If we don't make the ecologies that make creative things happen, no amount of making sliders on graphs is going to make cities more creative than actually making them a creative space that's cheap to occupy. I don't know where the next place is. I know a lot of young people in Manchester living in Longsight now. And Longsight is is quite an interesting bit of town to live in because it's quite cheap. And in a sort of in an owner-occupier sort of world, you know, where you buy a house for £90,000 and then you let 2 of the rooms to your mates. You know, so I know quite a lot of the artists I know and bands do that sort of thing now because it's an owner-occupier sort of world. You know, so maybe there's different cultures in an owner-occupier world that I haven't really known about. I'm too old. We need new blood. I need to retire.
Any final comments or questions for Greg before we head to the pub, which is where we're going to go next, by the way, Eagle and Child, in a few minutes' time? No? Greg, thank you so much. There's some fantastic talks, some great sound bites there. I might be seeing some of them in my lectures and in my essays that people are going to submit. So I look forward to that. But there's some great ideas in there and really got everyone thinking, I'm sure.
Okay.
So thanks very much. Thank you.